We're going to save all of our cities, and we're going to make them essentially crime-free.
Since June of 2025, thousands of National Guard troops have been deployed to 4 U.S. cities: Los Angeles, Washington, D.C., Chicago, and Memphis. And if President Donald Trump has his way, Portland, Oregon will be 5th on the list. Hello, and welcome to a special episode of USA Today's The Excerpt. I'm Dana Taylor. Trump says the deployments are a push to crack down on crime and to support his widespread deportation efforts. But when a president deploys the National Guard, over the objections of governors and local mayors is the decision about keeping the peace or testing the limits of executive power. Here to help me unpack the issues surrounding this unprecedented deployment of U.S. troops on American soil is USA Today breaking news reporter Michael Loria. Michael, it's really good to have you on.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Are legal boundaries being tested here with the deployment of the National Guard for domestic operations, such as those protecting ICE agents? How's the Trump administration responded to the accusations of federal overreach?
Yeah, absolutely. As we're seeing from the pushback from attorney generals in democratically led states, these lawyers are saying that Trump is crossing a lot of lines. From lawyers in D.C. saying that they're violating the district's right to govern itself, to attorneys in Illinois basically questioning whether the justifications that the Trump administration is making around deploying the troops are tethered to reality. In that case, the Trump administration had said that there was a rebellion about to take place in Illinois, and the Illinois Attorney General's office called that into question. In terms of, what the Trump administration is saying, I think that for their part, they're not so much concerned about executive overreach. They're concerned about overreach of these local jurisdictions. They're saying that these jurisdictions are overstepping their bounds by trying to limit the president's power around deploying troops.
These deployments have faced stiff resistance from Democratic leaders, as you said, on the city, state level. Are there other arguments being made on the national level?
States are looking to see how these court cases are going to play out because they're going to impact, these deployments across the country. For example, we could talk about California and how that case is playing out in the Ninth Circuit, where essentially the Trump administration had deployed these troops saying that they needed to protect federal facilities in California. However, these same National Guard members from California have been now sent to Illinois. The Trump administration has tried to send them to Portland, Oregon. And in the words of the Attorney General in California, that undermines the whole argument that they're needed in California. So we'll see where that lands and see whether that has an impact on whether Trump can deploy these troops at all.
Michael, what have the court said so far about Trump federalizing the National Guard, and what does that even mean?
Right. Good question. Federalizing the National Guard. I've been trying to think about a good way to explain this, which is essentially that these are state National Guard members that are at the order of the president being forced to kind of change their penny, so to speak, or change their jersey, so to speak, and become troops for the federal government instead. In terms of what the courts have said about this, at the district level, the judges have had some very pithy and, pretty sharp remarks. For example, I was here in Illinois listening to court proceedings, and the judge here, April Perry, was really questioning whether it was justified to send in the National Guard. And I found it pretty striking when she essentially really laid the credibility of the Trump administration on the line and asked whether they were tethered to reality or not. However, a lot of these cases are getting appealed, right? And they're going to the appellate courts, and the appellate courts are they're not really saying a whole lot. They're taking a position which isn't maybe that surprising, but they're trying to maintain the status quo. And the status quo at the moment is that, yes, Trump has taken control of these troops. However, are they in the streets? No. And they're not going to, at least for now, they're not going to let him go ahead with that move of deploying these troops in these streets.
President Trump has floated the idea of invoking the Insurrection Act. What would that act allow him to do here?
This is another card that they could play, which would, in many ways, trump the legal arguments that attorney generals have been making around the country in terms of Trump deploying troops. However, I just want to highlight how rare this act has been invoked. I mean, it's been on the books since 1878 and only been used, I think, 30 times. And in terms of the instances where this gets used, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln invoking the Insurrection Act during the Civil War. The last time it was invoked was in 1992. H.W. Bush invoked it during the Rodney King riots. However, a big difference there was that the then governor of California wanted the National Guard to come in to help out. That's quite a different situation from what we're seeing today, where Gavin Newsom, Governor J.B. Pritzker in Illinois are both saying, hey, we don't want you here. We don't need your help.
There's been a lot of noise in the cities. There have been protests, including a naked bike ride by cyclists in Portland, Oregon, who demonstrated against Trump's deployment plan with a rainy 4-mile ride. What else is happening on the ground in the various cities where there are troops?
We have not seen that type of protest here in Chicago. It's not a very Midwestern way of expressing yourself. However, we have seen a lot of marches downtown along Michigan Avenue, folks, protesting right outside of Trump Tower, right? And we're talking thousands and thousands of people, and we're expecting more of that this weekend. So, the pushback, I think, has been pretty vociferous. And I think I'd also want to highlight, too, that one of the things that's come up in court here in Chicago is how the chaos that the Trump administration talks about that they want to quell by using the National Guard could actually be sparked by deploying the National Guard. That's one of the things that the judge here in Chicago said, that, in fact, deploying the National Guard would only add fuel to the fire that the Trump administration has started in this city.
Sticking with that, is it clear to what degree these National Guard deployments are responding to actual increases in crime or real threats to ICE agents? There's been quite a bit of criticism on this point, with some saying that it's just a way for the president to punish cities with Democratic leadership.
Right. You're raising a really good point, which is the main argument that Homeland Security is making, is that their agents are experiencing an unprecedented level of violence. They cite figures of 1,000 level increases in assaults on ICE agents, and we have seen a lot of tense moments, right, between agents and civilians. But a couple of these things are worth highlighting, where some of these civilians, for instance, have been charged with federally assaulting officers, but a lot of times these cases are not going anywhere. And I'd like to highlight the case of one couple here in Chicago that they were arrested outside of an immigration enforcement facility. And after they were arrested during a protest, they were found to have guns on them. This is something that Homeland Security announced pretty loudly, saying, this is quite alarming, especially after that attack on an ICE facility in Dallas. And on its face, I mean, it does sound very alarming, right? However, that's leaving aside the fact that we have the Second Amendment, which gives them the right to carry guns. And they were found to be lawfully carrying the guns. And they weren't involved in the protests at all. The guns were not. And then ultimately, the cases against them were dismissed. The grand jury failed to indict them, which itself is pretty significant because, as like the old saying goes, a grand jury could indict a ham sandwich.
Michael, your colleagues have been on the ground in Portland to get a better sense of how residents are feeling on the ground there. What are they reporting?
This is something where we're seeing, I think that a lot of the residents of these cities who are kind of waiting to see whether troops will be deployed are trying to highlight just how good things are in these cities, and how, restaurants are still packed, cafes are packed. If these places are really at such risk, why do things actually feel quite good? And I've seen that also here in Chicago as well, where at the same time that we're considering the reality of having troops on the ground, we have, tens of thousands of people going out to watch the Cubs.
I think it's important to dig into the National Guard training. Are these troops even trained for civil law enforcement and crowd control? And if not, what are they trained for?
The short answer is no. They're trained for combat, right? And they're not trained in the complexities of civilian law enforcement, which includes having to understand, things from criminal procedure to civil rights to, how to handle a civilian crowd, which can be quite tricky in terms of, respecting their civil liberties. Whereas these troops are, again, trained for combat. They're trained to help out with things like national disasters. For example, the National Guard in California, they help out with wildfires. They help out at the border. It's a range of things that they do, but civilian law enforcement is not one of them.
As we've discussed, the focus of these deployments has been on cities run by Democrats. To date, has the Trump administration mentioned plans to deploy the National Guard to any Republican-led cities? And what other cities led by Democrats might be on the list?
As far as I'm aware, I haven't heard of any Republican-led cities come up. It's mainly been democratically led cities, of course, Los Angeles, Chicago, Portland. Other ones that the Trump administration has mentioned are Baltimore, St. Louis, San Francisco. Um, Not among those, however, are some cities which are led by Republicans. And also not among them are some of the cities that experience some of the highest murder rates, right? We're talking about maybe Birmingham, Alabama, or Jackson, Mississippi.
Finally, Michael, I know that this is an evolving story, so what will you be watching for next?
Well, we talked about the Insurrection Act, which is something that we'll definitely be watching for. Another thing that we'll be watching for is kind of to see what the cost of all this will be. We're talking about thousands and thousands of troops across multiple cities. The federal government is on the hook for this. We know that at least for the California deployment, the governor's office there was able to obtain some records from the federal government that showed that the cost was around 120 million. So we'll see what the cost is elsewhere. And then I think a final thing that we're watching for is to see to what extent the court's orders will be upheld or respected. I keep thinking about some things that kept on happening in court where during the hearing over the National Guard deploying to Chicago, one of the things that the judge kept on saying to the Trump administration lawyers was, I understand that you don't think this decision is subject to judicial review, so thank you for humoring me and being here. So yeah, we'll see what happens.
Michael Loria is a breaking news reporter for USA Today. It's really good to have you on the Excerpt, Michael.
Thanks so much for having me on.
Thanks for watching. I'm Dana Taylor. I'll see you next time.